This is Kurt Hofer here with the European Conservative, and I'm here to interview Claire Rydell Arcenas and her new book, America's Philosopher, John Locke in the American Intellectual Life. Well, thank you so much, Claire, for joining us today.
I'm delighted to be here. Thanks so much for the invitation.
Let's get right to it. Maybe just a little bit of background on the book for our readers. What was the impetus behind this book about Locke, about John Locke? Why did you decide to embark on this project?
Yeah, so maybe I should first say that when I started this project, I had no idea that it would culminate in a decade-long investigation and then book on Locke's place in American intellectual life. This project began in graduate school when I became interested in the publication history of Locke's two treatises of government. And I had gone in search of 19th century editions of Locke's work on government for a seminar paper I was writing. And so I was spending a lot of time in what are called National Union catalogs. They're a kind of old school version of WorldCat. And one day, pretty early into my research, I discovered that Locke's two treatises weren't published in the United States by an American press for more than a century, between the 1770s and World War I, so for the duration of the 19th century.
And that surprised you.
Right. I mean, I find this absolutely surprising, shocking, puzzling, right? Because to me, like, I think for so many Americans who had gone to public school and I was immersed in a kind of American pop culture, I don't know, learned and somehow internalized that, in particular, the second treatise had always been Locke's most important, popular, widely read work, that it really was actually a kind of founding text for the American political tradition. And so this kind of absence, right, in terms of publication, not, I should say, importance or reception or any of the things I get into in the book itself, but this kind of absence of publication made me realize that the story of Locke in America maybe was more complex, more complicated, and actually more interesting than I thought it had been. And so I started asking just very, very basic questions about who Locke was for earlier generations of Americans.
Right. And I think that is a good segue into my next question for you, which is you talk about how in your book, Locke was originally not very, he wasn't necessarily associated with political philosophy by early Americans. He was more of the epistemologist, in your words. The sort of philosopher as opposed to the political theorist. Could you describe for our readers and our viewers, maybe give us a brief summary of how Locke made that transition in the American mind, if you like, from sort of more abstract philosopher, associated with the tabula rasa and other ideas like that, to becoming sort of a founding political father of the American Revolution?
Yeah, absolutely. Although I would say, as I'll make clear in just a minute, that I actually think the shift is from more concrete and human to more abstract from the 18th to the 20th century.
So not necessarily from political, from epistemologist to political philosopher, just from more concrete to more abstract?
Yeah, well, let me take a step back because your question gets at the sort of most important shift. And that is that, so for the last 300 plus years, right, Locke has been incredibly important and influential in American intellectual life. But the nature of his importance, the reasons why Americans care about Locke, these reasons have changed really dramatically between the 18th century, from the 18th century until the present day. And what this means is that, so across the 18th and 19th centuries, Americans know Locke, as you just said, first and foremost for what was then his most famous work, his essay concerning human understanding, which is his work that examines how humans gain knowledge about themselves and the world around them. It's his work of what will become known as epistemology. But they also revered him as a kind of guide and model and exemplar from whom they could learn how to go about and engage in everyday activities, things like rearing their children, cultivating good friendships, reading the Bible.
And also, one of the favorites that I had from your book, just to let you know, was that system of cataloging the books you've read and the information that you've gleaned from them so that you can always go back to your own sort of research catalog. I thought that was fascinating.
Yeah, exactly, right. And so they're turning to Locke as providing a really good method and model for keeping, as you just said, a commonplace book. So as a way to organize their thinking in the days before computers and note-taking apps, right? You had to have a way to remember what you had read years ago. And Locke provided 18th and 19th century Americans with, I think, the most popular method for what was called commonplacing, or what we can think of as note-taking, right? So Locke is an immediate presence in sort of ordinary people's daily lives. They know him first and foremost. They respect him and revere him primarily because of his work on human understanding. But this isn't to say that Americans in the 18th and 19th century don't read or engage with Locke's political writings. They absolutely did. But they didn't read Locke's political work in isolation. So they didn't construe Locke as first and foremost or primarily a political theorist. And perhaps more importantly, they didn't understand Locke and Locke's political writings as having exerted a kind of positive or continuing influence on American political intellectual life after the 1770s. Rather, in the immediate aftermath, as I explain and show in my book, in the immediate aftermath of the American Revolution and independence from Great Britain, Americans began scrutinizing a whole range of Locke's political writings, including the Second Treatise, and finding a lot of fault with them because they began to understand that Locke's political project ran counter to their so-called modern commitments to what were becoming understood as tenets of sort of modern political science, the science of politics. And in Locke's two treatises, right, they found a number of examples of this kind of outdated and, in their eyes, misguided, faulty political theorizing. Locke's attention to the sort of questions of the origin of government, and he uses thought experiments of the state of nature and social contract. And at the same time that they're finding fault with this approach to political philosophy that Locke and others are taking, they're also reading other political works of Locke's that we, I think, today have largely forgotten. And the most important of these was a work that they attributed to Locke. There's some debate now about whether or not that was the case, but in the 18th and 19th centuries, Americans understood that Locke had helped author a set of constitutions, a framework of government for the English colony of Carolina in North America in the 1660s. And in this, if you haven't read the Fundamental Constitutions of Carolina, highly recommend it. It's a sort of interesting work for a variety of reasons, but they find it, 18th and 19th century Americans find a sort of horrifying example of like an abstract political theorizer, Locke, unable to actually construct a good framework of government for a real, in this case, colony in North America. They're very attached to this.
Right. So one thing I'm just going to point out here, and you can tell me if I'm putting words in your mouth or not, is Locke was criticized in the early by early American statesmen for being too theoretical and abstract in some cases. And what I think is interesting, and I'll try to get to this later in the interview, is that people are making that same criticism of Locke today, it seems like, but without acknowledging that he had already been criticized for that same fault centuries before.
Right, exactly. And I think that's really interesting. And the other thing that I would say, right, about that's particular to, or a feature of the way that 19th century Americans in particular are engaging with Locke's political writing, is the extent to which they're historicizing it. And they're trying to create a kind of wall or barrier between this old mode of political thinking and theorizing exemplified by someone like Locke and new, better, more scientific approaches to understanding politics and government exemplified by 19th century political scientists, people like Francis Lieber and others. And so we see this kind of separation being drawn and emphasized between Locke and the present that emerges and becomes very prominent in the 19th century. And then this is really the thing that shifts, to go back to to finally sort of answer the question that you posed a couple of minutes ago, right? This is what we see changing in the 20th century as a result of a combination of factors. The most important of which is that in the 20th century, Locke and his two treatises, in particular the second treatise, all of a sudden become useful for Americans who are trying to articulate and then defend for themselves and a global world a new concept, that of a sort of longstanding, even timeless American political tradition. And in the first part of the 20th century, Americans tear down this wall that had been separating the 17th century philosopher from the present day. And instead, they begin to draw a line of continuity connecting Locke to the American founding and the American founders and framers in the 18th century to America, the United States in the 20th century. And in so doing, they take Locke and they distill Locke into a couple of sort of key choice passages from the second treatise, and then use his perceived influence and the perceived influence of the second treatise on Americans past and present to answer big, important questions about what they viewed as American political exceptionalism, right? Namely, the question of why is American liberal democracy seeming, at least they're hoping, why is American liberal democracy immune to threats of totalitarianism, fascism, communism, and the like? And their answer is Locke and Locke's continued influence as they've now reinvented it. And so as a result, by the 1950s, it begins more in the 1930s and 1940s, but really by the 1950s, Locke is best understood by Americans as a political thinker, the political thinker author of the second treatise, and a kind of political abstraction in a way connected to a tradition of liberalism in particular. And all of the other parts of Locke and Locke's thought and life that had made him so important and influential for generations of Americans earlier in the 18th and 19th century, all these other parts of Locke disappear. And people don't really care about Locke on child rearing or commonplacing or friendship or whatever else. They really cared about him in the 18th and the 19th century.
Yes, I'm going a little bit off script here, but that word liberalism that you pointed out, when would that word liberalism, as associated with John Locke, when did that word come into vogue? And because I'm assuming John Locke never would have heard the term liberalism, or am I incorrect?
No, you're exactly right. And I'm certainly not the first person to draw attention to this or point this out, but the close association between Locke and liberalism, so much so that Locke becomes an adjective Lockean as a modifier for this political ideology of liberalism.
Yes.
This doesn't emerge until the 1940s, and we see it really flourishing in the 1950s. There are instances of conversations about Locke's association with different variations of liberalism or liberal democracy in the 1930s, as I show in my book. But these are associations, and they're more sort of questions without a lot of certainty about what the stakes or the implications of this are and what exactly we mean by liberalism when we're talking about Locke as having been or being an important influence on it. Are we talking about a kind of small L liberalism with a commitment to individual rights, say in a minimal government? Or are we talking about a kind of big L, what we might understand in the 20th century, as a kind of big L liberalism, more concerned about a commitment or concern for, say, the greater societal good. And so there's a lot of question and debate about Locke's association with the term and the concept liberalism before Locke and liberalism become smashed together and married in the 1940s.
In the 1940s, so that's the key decade. Interesting. Your book brings the discussion of Locke's legacy, I want to say, almost to the present, but maybe not quite. Your last chapter discusses the sort of competing liberal, as in left liberal, and libertarian claims to Locke's legacy made by John Rawls and Robert Nozick, respectively, in the 1970s. Is there a particular reason that you end the discussion there in the 70s instead of coming closer to the present and Locke's contested legacy, right now?
So yes, and the short answer is that I'm a historian, not a political philosopher or a political commentator today. And I think that in some ways, emphasizing my commitment to the craft or my goals as a historian is important to emphasize, because I think that this is one of the major obstacles that my book faces. In a world where people across the political spectrum, whether or not you find yourself on the right or the left or somewhere in the middle, open a book like mine, America's Philosopher, and read it expecting that I have some covert or not so covert political agenda to advance, which is not the case. And so for me, thinking about sort of why do I not bring the story up into the present? Why do I feel more comfortable in or spend time in what I think of as being the past, the sort of pre-1970s world, we'll say. It's a somewhat arbitrary cutoff. But for me, it's an important one because, well, maybe I'll say two things for sort of two reasons. So what does it mean to approach this question of Locke and Locke's place in American intellectual life from a past historical standpoint rather than sort of driven by present day concerns or questions or debates? And the two things I'll say about this are that, and sort of two reasons why this is important for me. First, and maybe somewhat counterintuitively, I need to understand and be aware of these contemporary debates and interpretations of Locke, but I can't allow them to cloud my investigation into the past. And so what this means is that while I need to be aware, for example, of the incredible and I think very interesting work being done, say, on questions about Locke's relationship to slavery, and in particular, slavery in a North American context. These are important and valuable questions that people today in the 21st century are asking, and they're uncovering really sort of new and interesting things. I need to be aware that these are questions that my audience might have in mind, but that they're not the questions that my historical subjects, when they're writing and thinking about Locke in the 1830s, are concerned about. And to give another example, right, a very sort of clear example of the differences between approaching things from sort of the past versus the present perspective, to oversimplify things. In, I think it was 2019, there was a lot of interest because a new manuscript of Locke's had been discovered, in which Locke actually spends a lot of time weighing the pros and cons of extending religious toleration to Catholics. Of course, he ultimately decides that he doesn't extend religious toleration the same way to Catholics that he does to other religious groups. But this manuscript opened up a whole new world for us in terms of Locke's own intellectual development on this question. And so thanks to this discovery, this archival discovery of the manuscript, after 2019, I know a whole lot more about Locke's inner mind on the question of toleration than did anyone else I was writing about over the course of the 18th, 19th, and 20th centuries. And so the second big sort of commitment that I have as a historian is that my primary goal, the primary goal of my research and my writing, is a deeper and richer understanding of the past that others then can use, people who are political commentators or political philosophers, who are much better qualified than I am to be thinking and writing about issues in the context of the 2020s, we'll say, that they can use this history and this understanding that I provide to help them address current policy or political questions.
Well, you anticipated what was going to be my next question, which was, are these is this book still worth reading to the non-academic audience in terms of, let's just say, political junkies who follow very closely the debates on the new right about John Locke, or the debates about populism versus sort of establishment conservatism and things like that? And it sounds like you just answered my question there by saying you're hoping that this book will give those readers specifically a more nuanced understanding of John Locke. Is that correct?
Absolutely. So I think both a more nuanced understanding of Locke, but maybe even more than that, actually, a more nuanced understanding of past debates and questions about Locke's influence and relevance and importance, and perhaps understanding that current debates and questions that are emerged, maybe in particular, as you just said, among those on the sort of the new right, that a lot of these questions and debates aren't actually new to the 21st century, and that rather they have either roots in or they find echoes in earlier conversations about Locke and his place in American intellectual life or the American political tradition.
Right. So I'm going to try to bring you into the present against the impetus of your book, perhaps. I have a couple quotes from from different political thinkers about John Locke. One is from Patrick Deneen, the author of Why Liberalism Failed. The other is from Yoram Hazony, both thinkers that we might identify with the new right or the populist nationalist movements that are springing up across the West and around the world. And I just want to quote them for you and try to get your response to them as somebody who spent a lot of time reading about Locke, reading Locke's primary sources. So here's one quote from Patrick Deneen. In contrast to ancient theory, which understood liberty to be achieved only through virtuous self-government, modern theory defines liberty as the greatest possible pursuit and satisfaction of the appetites, while government is a conventional and unnatural limitation upon this pursuit. A main goal of Locke's philosophy is to expand the prospects for our liberty, defined as the capacity to satisfy our appetites through the auspices of the state. So that's Patrick Deneen defining what I would call his definition of Lockean liberalism as the satisfaction of individual appetites, okay? And then here is Yoram Hazony in his book, The Virtue of Nationalism. In reducing political life to the individual's pursuit of life and property, Locke did not merely offer an impoverished and unsuccessful account of human motivation and action. His political theory summoned into being a dream world, a utopian vision in which the political institutions of the Jewish and Christian world, the nation state, community, family, and religious tradition appear to have no reason to exist. An individual who has no motives other than to preserve his life and expand his property, and who is under no obligations other than those to which he has consented, will have little need for any of these things. Are these fair readings of Locke or unfair readings?
So before I opine on that, I mean, the first thing that strikes me about both of these quotes, and this is something we can maybe talk about in a minute, is the extent to which they harken back to earlier critiques of Locke, particularly critiques that emerge in the mid-20th century from right-leaning, we'll say conservative intellectuals, people like Leo Strauss and Wilmar Kendall. And importantly, of course, as such, they reveal the extent to which these critiques, these earlier critiques, failed to become mainstream, in that we're needing to revisit this conversation again in the 21st century. But sort of setting that aside, to the more specific question about whether or not these are correct or sort of fair, accurate renderings of Locke, I mean, I think the question or the answer is that it depends. Are we talking about Locke in a 17th century context in a world of absolute monarchies and religious authoritarianism and early modern social structures and conventions? Or are we talking about Locke as a political philosopher, theorist, plucked from this past and abstracted and repackaged into sort of politically expedient catchphrases that we can use, let's say, to inform contemporary conversations and debates or justify certain policy objectives? And I think insofar, in the case of the former, insofar as we seek to understand Locke in the context of the 17th century, understand Locke's political philosophy in the context of its goals and aims several centuries ago, I think these renderings are overly reductive or even simplistic. Most significantly, though, for the fact that they focus only on a very, very small part of the Lockean puzzle, so to speak. They focus very much on the centrality of the individual in Locke's second treatise, without paying attention to the broader corpus of Locke's writings and other aspects of Locke's thought, which I actually think they'd find a lot more, find much more appealing, and find a lot in there that might be more acceptable to them, namely Locke's writing and emphasis on the role of the family, in particular the role that parents play in rearing children, or even Locke's own deep religiosity, even if he's arguing against some aspects of sort of traditional church and the relationship between church and state, but sort of Locke's deep theological commitments. At the same time, so sort of setting those things aside just briefly, I mean, at the same time, right, the passages that you just read, I think illuminate really nicely that Locke's legacies are continuing to be contested and debated, just as they have been, for 3 or more centuries.
Right. Well, thank you for that very robust answer to my question. And I just want to reemphasize what you said, which is that some of these contemporary debates about Locke are echoes of debates that had already been occurring, like you said, in the 50s and 60s about Locke as well, which I think is very fascinating. My last question for you, and again, like the word liberalism, this is a word that I'm assuming John Locke would not have used, would not, it's an anachronistic term, just like liberalism. But in your estimation, does John Locke belong in the conservative camp? Yes or no, and why?
So, as maybe you've figured out, it's going to be hard to get just a simple yes or no out of me. But I mean, of course, right, how I or anyone answers this question has everything to do with how we understand or define conservative or conservatism, and how we understand or interpret Locke. So let me say this, though, that in the context of the 17th century, Locke, as we know him for his most famous political writings and works, in particular the second treatise, and others, and I can say more about that in a minute, but is what we might think of as, and I think can accurately characterize as being fundamentally or even anti-conservative, if we take conservative in its traditional sense. And I think this is some of the pushback, or some of the reasons why Locke receives such pushback from those who would see themselves as belonging to a kind of post-liberal new right. And this is what they find so profound, or these are these issues that they have with Locke are some of the reasons why we might also actually understand Locke as being profoundly unconservative in the context of his day. After all, let me explain what I mean by this, right? Locke's writing to counter longstanding commitments to church and government, society and family, to tradition and often oppressive modes of operating this church, government, family, society. And Locke, in his other works, is also writing to elevate the pursuit of truth and knowledge and understanding through rationality. And in his day, right, these sorts of arguments about the positive potential of individuals, ordinary individuals, to understand and make meaning of and ultimately better their world, these are profoundly destabilizing, either in an exciting way or a terrifying way.
But also profoundly democratic, it sounds like.
So
Or not.
well, so to some extent, I think they can be interpreted as that, yes, profoundly democratic in a small d democratic sense, but also profoundly to sort of unconservative, if we take conservative in the sense of aiming to conserve or preserve past or existing institutions, real or imagined. And so, of course, as your question gets at, there's a lot that we can say about the ways in which certain aspects of Locke's life and work can and have been, I think, effectively interpreted as conservative in contemporary parlance, especially as advancing a minimalist government argument, or the idea that the sort of best sort of government is that government which governs least. But rather than focus on those, which I think readers and listeners will be very familiar with, let me maybe just say something of the sort that I would often tell and remind my students, and that's this. Like, Locke is a man, he's a human being who changes his mind and evolves and thinks differently over the course of his life, in the way that you or I probably think differently than we did maybe 5 or 10 years ago, and we might think differently in the 5 or 10 years from now. And so for a long time, biographers of Locke, in particular his main 20th century biographer, Maurice Cranston, have recognized the extent to which, before about the 1660s, so in Locke's very early years, formative years, we'll say, Locke is actually much more conservative, much more sort of pro-monarchy, pro even authoritarian. His biographers sometimes use this language of pro-authoritarian in religion and politics than he will become after the 1660s. And so recognizing that Locke's own thinking and political trajectory changes over the course of his life is important, because I think it reminds us, right, that when we speak about Locke and questions of political ideology, whether or not they're questions of conservatism or liberalism or whatever else, we need to pay attention to and be attentive to a kind of intellectual, intellectual slippage, I might say, between, or that happens when we conflate Locke and the sort of one or two arguments, say for private property or minimal government, for which he's best known today. And I think there's a lot of room for much richer and much more nuanced readings and interpretations of Locke that recognize how his own thinking changed over the course of his life, and that pay attention to the wide range of Locke's work and thought, not just his political writing.
And maybe attention to the wider range of his thought would also lead to a more enriched public debate in the political sphere. Is that possible?
So. I think so.
Well, let's end on that positive note. Thank you so much for your time, Claire, and I definitely recommend anyone who has the chance, get the book, America's Philosopher, John Locke in American Intellectual Life, and learn a little bit more about Locke than the caricature that you may have been taught. Thank you.
Thank you so much.